Civilization 7 has been now showcased at Gamescom by the developers and by a lot of previewers, and it is time to talk about the three biggest changes. Well, I say the three biggest changes, there are definitely more in Civilization 7, but I think that those three changes we will talk about in this video are really important, and there's already some big discussions going on in the community about those changes. Some of them love them, some of them hate them. Now, before we jump in there, two things I want to make clear. First things first, I have not played Civilization 7. I have watched now hours of footage of Civilization 7 and listened to people what they have to say. So I think I have a pretty good understanding how some of those gameplay elements work. Second, and this is also very important, I know that there will be discussions about how realistic a few things are, and people want to talk about, like, I like that, that's shit, I don't like this. And that's completely fine. Please be civilized, though, in the comments. But I don't think I'm really the person for this kind of discussion. I love to discuss how does this really affect the balance and how good will this be from a purely gameplay perspective. And when they do everything right, I don't really care too much how the optics will be on how realistic this might be. I always felt like that Civilization was grounded in some realism, but most of the time is purely fantasy. I mean, you are leading a leader who is immortal with a nation which sometimes didn't even existed at the time when you start Civilization or when the game ends. Some of those civilizations were eradicated, right? So it's basically alternate history with a lot of fantasy elements. And this is how I also feel about like some of the changes when people want to have a discussion how realistic that is. I am just not the person for that. With that said, let's talk about those changes. The first thing is definitely the biggest and probably the most controversial one is that you can now choose your leader and your civilization independently. Why do they do this? Well, the answer is balance. The reality is, when you are looking back at the other civilization games, you realize very quickly that they are civilizations which are good in early game, mid game, and end game, but they fall off at all the other ages, right? So let's say you are choosing Egypt, which is good at the early game stages, but it will completely fall off in the mid and end game. And then you have sometimes 20, 30 hours ahead of you with a civilization which does absolutely nothing. And the same goes for civilizations which are good in the end game, because it takes so long before they can take off. And that is a huge problem. So this is why they are now giving you the option to choose a leader, which will give you some perks, and then choose a civilization per age. Now, how does this whole age thing work? Well, it's actually pretty simple. We have three ages, and I know that some people are already saying, oh man, only three ages. They cut some of the ages away, and it's much less now in the game. This sucks. No, you misunderstand a little bit. So we have three ages, right? But those are macro ages. And then we have micro ages inside of those ages. So let's take the first age, the age of antiquity. And there's the overarching age, but you will have like the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age inside the age of antiquity. The same goes for the age of discovery. You're basically starting probably in the medieval ages, then you were going through the Renaissance and so on. We don't know really the specifics here yet, because even all the previewers only had the ability to play through the first age. But again, we know how the first age looks, and that they have basically micro ages. And then you are at the end of the age, will have like a catastrophe happening to the world, and you have to react to it and you have to deal with it, which also makes the whole thing very interesting depending on the nation and the leaders you choose. And as I said, this makes it so much more interesting, because a lot of the playstyles we have seen throughout the Civilization games was always, you will try to find a nation and a leader which is hyper focused on something, and then you try to excel on that. But the moment something got in the way, you were screwed. you could actually just restart the game at this point. Like, let's say you want to focus on research, and after the first 50 rounds, you realize, oh man, research was such a bad idea with the neighbors I have, with the map I'm on, with the resources nearby. This sucks. This was just not good. I have to restart because I'm already too far behind and I cannot keep up. Now, you don't really, hopefully, have to do this with Civilization 7 because at some point there will be a cutoff point and they say, okay, new age, new civilization, maybe you want to change things around this time. And I'm really hoping that for the balance sake and that you always have to do something, changing civilizations is the right thing to do. Now, I know that some people are concerned because humankind has done something similar, but it seems like civilization has learned from this because in Civ, A, you don't have that many civilizations, and we don't know really what happens when somebody else is also taking a civilization. I don't know if you were then locked out. That was a big problem in humankind, right? When somebody got the civilization before you got there, which really sucks. But the second problem was that you could choose all the civilizations. And in Civ, that's not the case, right? You cannot just, with Egypt, you cannot become England, right? You cannot do that. Like, they want to make it so that it kind of makes sense in a certain area. Like, I know people will be like, yeah, Egypt and Mongolia, right? Yeah, that makes sense. Lol. Yeah, I understand. Again, from a realistic perspective, it doesn't really. But from a gameplay perspective, it maybe does. Maybe those civilizations are close to each other in what they are doing and what they are building on. And from a balance perspective, it will actually make sense when you are playing it. And that's what I'm hoping for. The next thing we have to talk about are cities and how we build. Now, this is probably a pretty big change for a lot of people, but the builders are gone. They're completely gone, no more builders. And what you are now doing is you're building your city center and then you are starting to sprawl out the city in the region you have occupied with your city. This is also something they took from humankind. Again, I don't want to say that too often because it always sounds like, oh, look, Civ just did steal everything from humankind. They did not. As somebody who has played humankind and who sees like what Civ is doing, yes, there are definitely similarities, but they are still trying to be very close to what the previous Civilization games did. But going back to the city building, yes, Civilization 7 is now having those sprawling cities. It looks much better. I think it will also be better of thinking about what you really want to do with your city, right? You have to plan a little bit more ahead than what you did in the previous Civ games, where you just took the resources in your region first, and then you slowly started to think about, okay, where do I want to put my improvements? But in this case, you have to start from the city center and then you slowly have to stretch out your empire. And that means you have to do quite a bit of planning here and there. And that leads us also to another addition, the city limit. Yes, you will now be limited on how many cities you can have. And again, I think that's a pretty good idea. Too often, and I've done it myself in the previous Civ games, you were just throwing cities out there without really having a plan of utilizing them. Like, you wanted to get a specific strategic resource, or you wanted to get a luxury resource, or something like that, or you even just wanted to cover a mountain ridge for better defense. You would just throw a small city there, wouldn't really do anything with it, and then move on. And you can still do that because cities do not start out as cities, they start out as villages, but you cannot really build anything in there. They're just producing gold for you. And yes, you can take the resources in the area the village is occupying, but it doesn't really grow, it doesn't produce units for you, and so on and so forth. And then at some point, you can decide if this village is becoming a city. And again, I think that's such a better solution. It stops the whole I have to build as many cities as possible everywhere just to get a few resources here and there. And then I have like 20 production lines of cities I'm not even using, right? That was always a little bit annoying. And I think that's a good change nonetheless. The third thing I want to talk about is diplomacy. Diplomacy is the last thing for today, at least. And I am so glad that it seems like that diplomacy is now an important part of civilization. Before that, diplomacy was mostly, hey, you like me? I guess. Okay, cool. Do you want to trade? Yeah, sure, let's trade. Okay, let's never talk again till I declare war to you or I denounce you. Have a good one. Right? There was mostly the other Civ games. Now, on this one, you can actually interact with other people. You can try to build more trust. You can get buffs depending on how much you want to spend your resource for diplomacy. And you can also now do things beyond just denouncing somebody or declaring war, something I actually talked about in a video a few weeks ago, that I really want to see more interactions there before you are going to the last defense, which is declaring war on somebody, right? And speaking of declaring war, I don't want to talk too much about it, but it seems like also now that depending on your diplomatic interactions with another faction slash civilization, you also will now get buffs or debuffs for the war effort, right? So if you are investing a lot of diplomacy into the war effort, you will actually get some perks which will make you stronger against the other civilization. And you can also interact with other NPCs while they're at war and be like, "Hey, you're at war with somebody. I don't like that much. Sorry, but I will cut off all the trading with you, right? Or something else you can do." So they showcase the trading. This is why I'm mentioning it. So I love that you have now more interactions with the other civilizations beyond just I don't like you. Okay, I told you that I don't like you. Now I have to declare war. And I'm really looking forward to that. And it seems like that diplomacy is becoming much more important, and round to round diplomacy will be one of the bigger parts of Civilization 7. But all in all, I love the changes. I'm curious to see how they play out. And yes, I am aware that Firaxis has a history of adding new things which will not always work as we wanted it to be. I'm just hoping they have learned, and if something is coming up and they might listen to the community and they might see, okay, this was a bad idea, they might change it in the future. I mean, they still have a little bit of time before the game is coming out. With that said, if you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to leave a like and also subscribe to the channel if you want to see more Civilization 7 videos. Not only that, this channel is exclusively focusing on strategy games, so if you like them and if you like my coverage, I would appreciate the sub. With that said, stay safe and I'll see you next time